There is a woman who has not been seen since the first day of June, 2017. No farewell. No final phone call. No handwritten note left on a kitchen counter to explain where she was going or when she planned to come back. No digital trail that investigators could follow with any confidence. No sighting that anyone could verify. No closure for the people who loved her and spent the years after her disappearance replaying every memory they had of her, searching those memories for a clue, for a detail they might have missed, for something, anything, that might explain how a living, breathing, 39-year-old woman with blonde hair and blue eyes and tattoos on both wrists could simply cease to exist in the middle of an ordinary summer in Jacksonville, Florida. Her name was Cresenda Stevens. And this is her story. This is Cold Case Crimelab. And tonight, we are going all the way to the bottom. Before we go a single second further, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to Cold Case Crimelab so you never miss a case like this one. And drop a comment below with Chriscinda's name, because she has been missing for nearly a decade and not enough people are still saying her name out loud. Every comment, every like, every share pushes this video in front of someone who might know something. Someone who saw that gold Ford Explorer. Someone who knows what happened on June 1, 2017. Hit subscribe. We are just getting started. There is always a before. Every disappearance, no matter how sudden it seems, no matter how completely a person appears to have vanished from the surface of the earth, has a before. A life that existed in full color and full dimension before the moment everything changed. And if we are going to understand what happened to Cresenda Stevens, if we are going to do right by her memory and take this case seriously in the way it deserves to be taken seriously, then we have to start there. We have to start with who she was. Not who she became in a missing persons database entry, not the collection of physical descriptors and vehicle information and investigative agency contact numbers. Not the case file. The woman. Cresenda Stevens was born on January 27, 1978. She was a child of the late 70s, which means she came of age in a world before smartphones, before social media, before the digital architecture that now allows investigators to reconstruct the final days and hours of a missing person's life through text messages and GPS data and surveillance footage pulled from every corner of a city. She grew up in an era when your footprint was mostly physical, when disappearing, truly disappearing, was both easier and harder than it is today. Easier because the tools to find you were more limited. Harder because the people who loved you had almost no way to reach across the distance if something went wrong. By the time she was 39 years old, Chriscinda had accumulated a lifetime of experience, of relationships, of moments that mattered, of the ordinary texture of a human existence that no missing persons report could ever fully capture. She stood 5 feet and 2 inches tall. She weighed 108 pounds. She had blonde hair. She had blue eyes. She had multiple piercings, her ears, her nose, her upper lip. She had tattoos that she had chosen deliberately, the way people choose the marks they carry on their bodies forever. On both wrists, she wore rainbow wave patterns. On her right bicep, she carried something more elaborate, a detailed tattoo depicting Little Red Riding Hood and the Big Bad Wolf. If you have ever seen that image, you know it is not a small or subtle thing. It is a story. It is a fairy tale inked into skin, one of the oldest stories humans have ever told each other about danger and innocence and the things that lurk in the dark spaces between where you are and where you are trying to go. She also had a cesarean section scar on her abdomen, which tells us something quiet and enormous about her life, that she had carried a child, or children, that there was a moment of surgical intervention and recovery, that there was a before that extended further back than most people talking about this case will ever know. She was driving a gold Ford Explorer. Georgia license plates. The driver's side door was damaged. The rear taillight on the driver's side was damaged. The driver's side window or windshield may have been broken. It is the kind of vehicle that stands out, not because it is flashy or unusual, but because it is damaged in specific, noticeable ways. The kind of damage you remember. The kind of damage that, if you saw it parked outside a gas station or sitting at a traffic light on a Tuesday afternoon, you might say to yourself, somebody had a rough time. And then you might forget about it entirely. Or you might not. You might be the person who saw that car and holds the piece of the puzzle that nobody has been able to find for nearly 9 years. Here is what the record tells us about the last known day of Cresenda Stevens' life. It was June 1, 2017. A Thursday. The kind of early summer day in Jacksonville, Florida that arrives already thick with heat and humidity, the air pressing down on the city with the particular weight that anyone who has spent time in the Florida lowlands knows intimately. The kind of day where the St. Johns River sits flat and brown and almost still on the surface, giving nothing away about what it is doing underneath. The last person known to have seen Cresenda Stevens alive was a man named Danny Vidal. That name is worth pausing on. Because when investigators and missing persons researchers refer to Danny Vidal in connection with this case, they do not use neutral language. The Charlie Project, which is one of the most comprehensive and carefully maintained missing persons databases in the United States, notes explicitly that Danny Vidal has a felony record and is considered armed and dangerous. Those are not qualifiers that get attached to a person's name in a missing persons case file without reason. Those are descriptors that tell you something about the context in which Cresenda Stevens was last seen. They tell you that the last person to see her alive is not someone investigators consider a benign or incidental figure in her story. The circumstances of her disappearance, according to the official record, are unclear. That word, unclear, does a lot of work in a missing persons case. It is not the same as saying there are no leads. It is not the same as saying there is no suspicion. It means the official picture is incomplete. It means that investigators have pieces but not enough pieces, or that the pieces they have do not yet fit together into a shape that allows them to make a definitive statement about what happened. It means that somewhere between the moment Danny Vidal last saw Cresenda Stevens and the moment her family realized she was not coming back, something occurred that has not been fully explained or accounted for. What we know is this: Chriscinda had a pattern of leaving the area from time to time. Her family knew this about her. It was not unusual, within the context of her life and her habits, for her to go somewhere for a period of time without a lot of advance notice. But, and this is the detail that transforms a voluntary absence into something that demands investigation, she always kept in touch. When she left, she communicated. She reached out. She let the people who cared about her know that she was okay. She maintained the thread of connection even across distance, even when she was away from home and away from the familiar patterns of her daily life. After June 1, 2017, that thread went silent. No calls. No messages. No contact of any kind. The woman who always kept in touch stopped keeping in touch entirely. And the people who loved her were left standing in that silence, waiting for a communication that never came, gradually understanding that this time was different. That this absence was not a voluntary departure. That something had happened. The Jacksonville Sheriff's Office opened a missing persons investigation. They classified Cresenda Stevens as endangered missing, a classification that signals law enforcement's belief that the missing person may be in danger, that this is not simply a case of an adult choosing to disappear from their life. They issued a public appeal. They put her description out through the media. They asked the residents of Jacksonville and the surrounding area to watch for her, to watch for the gold Ford Explorer with the Georgia plates and the damaged driver's side door and the broken window. They gave people a phone number, 904-630-2627, and asked anyone with information to call. The tips that came in, if any came in at all, were apparently not enough to break the case open. Months passed. A year passed. Multiple years passed. The case went cold in the way that cases go cold, not with any single dramatic moment of failure, but with the slow accumulation of silence. Investigators moved on to other cases because they had to, because the list of people who needed help was always longer than the resources available to help them. The media moved on because there were new stories, new crises, new missing persons whose cases were fresher and whose families were in the acute stage of grief rather than the long, grinding, years-long stage. And Cresenda Stevens remained in the database, a photograph, a description, a case number, a set of physical characteristics and an associated vehicle and a contact number for the investigating agency. She remained missing. She remained unfound. And the St. Johns River kept flowing through Jacksonville, carrying its secrets in the dark spaces beneath the tidal mud and the barnacled metal and the deep pockets of silt where things go when they are not meant to be found. Now let us talk about the river. Because in this case, in the case of Cresenda Stevens, the river is not background detail. The river is not scenery. The river is a character in this story, and it has been playing its role quietly, persistently, for the entire 9 years that this woman has been missing. To understand why a team of civilian divers traveled to Jacksonville specifically to search the St. Johns River as part of the investigation into Chriscinda's disappearance, you need to understand what this river is, what it does, and what it is capable of hiding. The St. Johns River is the longest river in the state of Florida. It stretches approximately 310 miles from its headwaters in Indian River County in the south to its mouth at Jacksonville, where it empties into the Atlantic Ocean. For most rivers, that would place the headwaters at a higher elevation than the mouth, because water flows downhill. The St. Johns is different. It is one of the few rivers in the United States that flows northward, and it does so across terrain so flat, an average drop of less than 1 inch per mile along its entire length, that its movement is less like a river flowing and more like a vast, slow, barely moving body of water breathing in and out with the tides. That tidal nature is critical. The St. Johns River is a tidal river for much of its lower length, including through the city of Jacksonville. This means that the water level rises and falls twice a day in response to the ocean tides, that the direction of current reversal can reverse completely depending on the tidal cycle, and that the bottom of the river, the mud and silt and clay that covers everything beneath the surface, is not a fixed, stable surface but a dynamic, constantly shifting environment that swallows objects and rearranges sediment and conceals things that were dropped or driven or pushed into its depths in ways that can make recovery extraordinarily difficult. When the tide comes in, the river swells. The water rises. The shallow areas that were nothing but dark mud and exposed bottom at low tide disappear beneath several feet of opaque, tannin-stained water. The deep pockets, the channels and holes and underwater depressions that can reach significant depths even relatively close to shore, fill with water that has come in from the ocean, water that carries with it the particulate matter and organic debris of a tidal estuary. When the tide goes out, it pulls that water back, and the river drops, and the shallow areas re-emerge as mud flats, and the deep pockets are still there, still full, still dark, still holding whatever they have been holding since the last time a person or a vehicle or an object entered them and sank. A vehicle submerged in a tidal river like the St. Johns does not behave the way a vehicle submerged in a lake or a still pond behaves. In still water, a sunken car will generally stay roughly where it landed, subject to some movement from underwater currents and the gradual accumulation of sediment around it. In a tidal river, the dynamics are more complex. The twice-daily reversal of current means the vehicle may shift over time. The surge of tidal flow can carry silt into and around a submerged object, covering it incrementally but continuously. Barnacles and other marine organisms colonize any hard surface they can find in brackish tidal water, coating it in the dense, calcified clusters that make identification difficult. A vehicle that has been in the St. Johns River for a year looks different from a vehicle that went in last week. A vehicle that has been there for 9 years may be barely recognizable as a vehicle at all without close examination. This is the environment that investigators and civilian searchers are working in when they drag sonar equipment through the waters around Jacksonville looking for submerged cars associated with missing persons cases. And there are many of those cars to look for. When Jeremy Sides and Adam Brown, the civilian dive team whose search forms the foundation of this investigation, arrived in Jacksonville and began mapping the stretch of the upper St. Johns that they intended to search on this particular trip, they identified at least 7 missing persons cases involving vehicles that could potentially be located in the area. 7. In one stretch of one river in one city. That number tells you something important about the scale of the problem, about the relationship between vehicle submersions and missing persons cases in urban waterways, about the quantity of unanswered questions that sit beneath the surface of a river that millions of people drive across on bridges every single day without thinking about what might be resting in the darkness below them. 3 cases in particular were the focus of their search on this day. Cresenda Stevens was one of them. Let us stop here and spend some time on the men who went looking for her, or at least for the vehicle that might tell us what happened to her, because they deserve more than a passing mention. They are not law enforcement. They are not professional investigators. They are civilians who developed a skill and a mission and a calling that has taken them to waterways across the United States in search of the kind of closure that official investigations, for all their resources and authority and training, have sometimes been unable to deliver. Jeremy Sides and Adam Brown operate under a brand that their audience knows well. They travel the country. They identify waterways that may be connected to cold cases or missing persons investigations. They bring sonar equipment and diving gear and an enormous amount of hard-won knowledge about how to search underwater environments effectively. They lower their sonar units into rivers and lakes and tidal channels and they watch the readout and they look for the shapes that do not belong, the angular, box-like outlines of vehicles that should not be resting on the bottom of an American waterway but are, because the history of this country includes a staggering number of cases in which a vehicle entered the water and was never recovered. The work is physically demanding in ways that are difficult to overstate. Diving in tidal rivers with poor visibility is not recreational diving. It is not the clear blue Caribbean water that most people associate with the word scuba. It is zero visibility or near zero visibility diving in water that may be cold, in current that may be unpredictable, in proximity to submerged structures and debris fields and the kinds of hazards that exist specifically because a body of water runs through an urban environment and has been receiving whatever people have been putting into it for decades. It is diving in water where the bottom is soft and the silt billows up in a cloud with every movement and where your hands are your eyes because your eyes are essentially useless. And then there is the emotional dimension of the work, which is harder to quantify but impossible to ignore. These men go into the water in the specific, deliberate hope of finding a car that may contain human remains. They search for evidence of deaths that have not yet been officially acknowledged as deaths. They enter cold cases that have devastated families and left communities with open wounds that years of unanswered questions have kept from healing. When they find something, the discovery is not a triumph in any simple or clean sense of the word. It is the beginning of a process, of notification, of official involvement, of formal recovery and identification and the reconstruction of events that a family has been dreading and hoping for and dreading again for however long their loved one has been missing. The gift of closure, as it has been described by those who understand this kind of loss, is absolutely priceless. It does not undo the loss. It does not bring anyone back. But it replaces the particular agony of not knowing with the different and in some ways more manageable agony of knowing, and for families who have been living in the not knowing for years, sometimes for decades, that exchange can be transformative. Jeremy and Adam know this. It is why they do what they do. And it is why, when they identified Jacksonville, Florida as a priority search area with multiple unresolved missing persons cases connected to waterways, they made the trip. The day of the search began with the particular combination of optimism and pragmatism that defines this kind of work. The team arrived at the water with their boat and their equipment and the specific intelligence they had gathered about the stretch of the upper, eastern section of the St. John's that was their focus for the day. They had done their homework. They knew which cases they were working. They knew the vehicle descriptions. They knew the general area where the vehicles might have entered the water based on the geography of each missing person's case, the known movements of each individual in the days and hours before they disappeared, the road layout of Jacksonville and the proximity of various locations to the river. What they also knew, from experience, was that the St. John's is a difficult river to search. The tidal dynamics create the conditions that have been described, the shifting sediment, the poor visibility, the constantly changing water levels that make a search area look completely different depending on what time of day you arrive and where the tidal cycle is at that moment. The water that looks deep and searchable at high tide may be nothing but shallow, impassable mud at low tide. The deep pockets that could conceal a submerged vehicle are scattered and unpredictable, located in areas that are not always obvious from the surface. They had an additional complication on this particular day: the boat's battery was dead. It is the kind of thing that happens in field work, in real operational conditions that do not conform to the idealized version of what an investigation should look like. The battery was dead, and they needed to jump it before they could get out on the water, and this happened in the presence of cameras that were documenting everything, which is worth acknowledging, because it is a reminder that the work these men do is not performed in controlled laboratory conditions. It is performed in the messy, unpredictable, equipment fails at inconvenient moments reality of fieldwork, and they handle it the way experienced fieldworkers handle it. They jump the battery. They get back in the boat. They go out on the water. With another team member alongside them, someone operating under the name Exploring with Nug, another figure from the civilian investigation community whose presence added both manpower and familiarity with these specific waters, they pushed out into the river. Exploring with Nug had been in these waters before. Had searched this stretch of the St. John's previously. Had come away from those earlier searches without finding anything significant, which was simultaneously discouraging and informative. The absence of a previous find did not mean there was nothing there to find. It meant the previous search had not located it. The deep pockets were the key, those submerged channels and depressions where a vehicle could sink and be held indefinitely by the surrounding topography, shielded from the current and accumulating silt and barnacles and the general obscuring accumulation of years spent at the bottom of a tidal river. The sonar went in. The boat moved. And the river began to give up its shapes. What sonar does, in broad terms, is this: it sends sound waves down into the water and measures how those waves bounce back. The return signal is processed into an image, a visual representation of the bottom of the waterway that allows searchers to identify objects based on their shape, their size, and their position relative to the riverbed. A flat, featureless bottom produces a certain kind of return signal. A rock or a log or a piece of debris produces a different kind. And a vehicle, with its distinctly angular, human-manufactured geometry, its flat surfaces and boxy overall outline, produces a return signal that an experienced sonar operator can learn to recognize even when the object is heavily silted or covered in marine growth. The images that came back from the sonar on this search were not ambiguous. The bottom of the St. John's River in this section, the upper eastern stretch that had been designated as the primary search area, was not empty. It was not the featureless mud flat it might appear from the surface. It was littered with submerged objects, some of which resolved on the sonar screen into shapes that stopped the team cold and made them slow the boat and bring it around for another pass. There were vehicles down there. Multiple vehicles. The team had identified at least 7 potential vehicle locations in the broader area before the search began, cross-referenced with known missing persons cases. What the sonar was now confirming in real time was that those identifications were not theoretical. The vehicles were there. Whether they were the specific vehicles associated with specific missing persons cases was a question that would require more investigation to answer, but the fundamental premise of the search, that the St. John's River in this area might be holding evidence related to disappearances that had gone unsolved for years, was being validated with every pass of the sonar unit. One shape in particular drew significant attention. It was near a bridge. Located in an area that was accessible by road, drive up to it, the team noted, meaning someone could have driven a vehicle to this location without attracting unusual attention. The profile on the sonar screen was strange in a specific way that the team found both interesting and troubling. It looked, as one of the searchers noted out loud, like a vehicle that had lost its roof. The upper portion of the shape was wrong, compressed, or absent, or significantly altered from what a standard vehicle profile should look like. The shape below the missing roof was recognizably vehicular. The outline was there. The size was right. But something had happened to the top of it. Barnacles. Years of accumulation. The possibility that the vehicle had rolled or been compressed by some impact before or during its entry into the water. All of these things could account for what the sonar was showing. None of them could be confirmed without sending a diver down for a direct visual examination. Another target produced a different kind of interest. This one appeared to have something inside the rear cargo area, a shape that looked, to the eyes of the team watching the sonar screen, like a toolbox. An object inside a submerged vehicle is significant for several reasons. It narrows the window of vehicle types you might be looking at. It suggests the vehicle went in with its contents intact rather than having been stripped or emptied before entry into the water. And in the context of a missing persons investigation, the presence of personal property inside a submerged vehicle is one of the details that can make identification possible. And then the sonar showed something else entirely. Something that was not a vehicle and was not the static clutter of the riverbed. Something that was moving. Something large. Circling the submerged shape. The St. Johns River is home to an enormous variety of aquatic life. Alligators are present in the river, this is Florida, and bodies of freshwater and brackish water in Florida are alligator habitat essentially by default, and the St. Johns has a resident population that is well documented and well known to anyone who spends time on the water. Large fish are present. Manatees enter and exit the river seasonally. Bull sharks, which are uniquely adapted to tolerate the transition between saltwater and freshwater, are documented in the St. Johns as far inland as Lake Monroe, a fact that is not generally known to people who have not spent time studying Florida's waterways, and that carries particular significance in the context of a search for human remains in a tidal river. The large shape circling the submerged vehicle on the sonar screen was not identified. It may have been a fish. It may have been an alligator. It may have been a manatee following the current around a novel obstacle on the riverbed. Whatever it was a reminder that the river is alive, that the world beneath the surface of the St. Johns is populated and active and indifferent to human concerns in the way that nature is always indifferent to human concerns. The team held their position and watched. And then they continued searching. Let us go back to Cresenda Stevens for a moment, because the search in the river is only one part of this story, and it is not the most important part. The most important part is the woman whose disappearance made the search necessary in the first place. One of the details that appears in every account of Chriscinda's case is the description of her pattern of movement. She had a history of leaving the area. This is relevant. It is relevant because it is the kind of detail that, in the early stages of a missing persons investigation, can cause hesitation. It can cause the people around a missing person, family members, friends, neighbors, to wait a beat longer before making the call to report someone missing. If someone has left before and come back before, the instinctive human response to their absence is to assume they have left again. To wait it out. To give it another day, another week, before escalating to an official report. And in that window of waiting, evidence cools. Trails go cold. The people who were with the missing person in the last hours of their documented life have more time to get their story straight, to move, to dispose of evidence, to create the kind of evidentiary distance that makes a subsequent investigation harder to conduct effectively. The key distinction in Chriscinda's case is the one that her family and the people who knew her have consistently emphasized: she always kept in touch. No matter where she went or how long she was gone, she maintained communication. She called. She sent messages. She let people know she was okay. She preserved the thread of connection because she understood, or because it was simply who she was, that the people who loved her deserved to know she was safe. When that thread went silent on June 1, 2017, it was not a gradual fading. It was an abrupt cut. A before and an after with no transition between them. There was Chriscinda, visible and present and communicating, and then there was not. And the not Chriscinda stretched from days into weeks and from weeks into months and from months into years, and the thread that had always been there was simply gone. That pattern, always keeps in touch, then suddenly stops completely, is one of the most significant indicators in a missing persons case that something violent or coercive has occurred. It is the pattern of someone who has been prevented from communicating, not someone who has chosen to disappear. It is the signature of an involuntary absence, not a voluntary one. The investigators who classified Cresenda Stevens as endangered missing understood this. The classification was not arbitrary. It was a reading of the available evidence that pointed toward danger rather than choice. And then there is Danny Vidal, the last person known to have seen Cresenda Stevens alive. The person in whose company or proximity she was located on June 1, 2017, at some point before the world lost track of her. The person who, when investigators and researchers describe him in connection with this case, is described with the specific, loaded language of a felony record and the warning that he is considered armed and dangerous. Understanding who Danny Vidal is and what his relationship to Cresenda Stevens was requires us to work with incomplete information, because not everything about his background and his connection to her is part of the public record in the way that makes it fully accessible for a documentary like this one. What is public is what the investigators and the missing persons researchers have chosen to make public: his name, his criminal history in general terms, and the assessment of dangerousness that has been attached to him in documents related to this case. What that tells us, without overstating it and without making claims that the evidence does not support, is that the last known circumstances of Chriscinda Stevens's life placed her in the orbit of someone who law enforcement considers dangerous. It tells us that her disappearance did not occur in a vacuum of ordinary, low-risk daily life. It tells us that the context matters, that the company she was in at the end of her documented story is one of the details that investigators have identified as significant. The circumstances of her disappearance, as the official record notes, are unclear. But unclear is not the same as innocent. And the silence that followed June 1, 2017, is not the silence of a woman who simply decided to stop calling home. Jacksonville, Florida is a city with water in its bones. It sits at the convergence of the St. Johns River and the Atlantic Ocean, and it is shaped in every meaningful sense by that aquatic geography. The river runs through the heart of the city, crossed by bridges, bordered by warehouses and parks and neighborhoods and marinas and all of the infrastructure of a major American urban center that has built itself around a body of water over the course of more than 2 centuries. The Port of Jacksonville is one of the busiest in the southeastern United States. The beaches that line the Atlantic coast draw tourists and residents in numbers that support entire economies. The waterways that thread through the city's interior, the creeks and tidal channels and tributaries that feed the St. Johns, are the connective tissue of a landscape that is as much water as it is land. This aquatic geography is one of the reasons Jacksonville appears repeatedly in discussions of missing persons cases involving vehicles. A city with as much water as Jacksonville, with as many access points to that water, bridges with low or absent barriers, boat ramps, unguarded waterfront areas, stretches of river where a vehicle could enter the water in the middle of the night without being observed, is a city where the river becomes a destination for things that people want to disappear. Stolen cars. Evidence. And sometimes, catastrophically, people. The history of vehicles recovered from Jacksonville's waterways is not something that gets regular media attention. It is not the kind of story that makes the evening news unless a specific, identified recovery is connected to a specific, identified case. But it is a history that civilian searchers like Jeremy Sides and Adam Brown have developed an intimate familiarity with, because they have searched these waters and they have found things that were not supposed to be there, and they have arrived at their own understanding of the scale of the problem. 7 vehicles in one stretch of one section of the river. That is the number that comes up in this specific search, the number of missing persons cases involving vehicles that could potentially be connected to the area being searched on this particular day. 7 families with open questions. 7 cases where the answer might be resting on the bottom of the St. Johns River within a few miles of each other, silting in, barnacling over, being circled by whatever large things patrol the bottom of a tidal river in northern Florida. 3 of those cases were the immediate focus of the search. One of them was Cresenda Stevens and her gold Ford Explorer. The gold Ford Explorer has its own role in this story. It is, in many ways, the most searchable element of Crescenda's disappearance, the most concrete, physically locatable thing that might tell investigators something definitive about what happened to her. A person can disappear in ways that leave almost nothing behind. A vehicle is harder to make vanish. A vehicle has weight and mass and specific dimensions. It leaves marks. It displaces water. It sits on the bottom of a river and changes the sonar signature of that section of riverbed in a way that, if a searcher knows what they are looking for, can be detected years or even decades after the vehicle entered the water. The Ford Explorer that Chriscinda was believed to be driving when she disappeared was gold in color. Or possibly tan. The early public appeals used both descriptors, which suggests that the exact color was not certain, perhaps because the vehicle's paint had faded or because different witnesses described it differently in different light conditions. It had Georgia license plates. The driver's side door was damaged. The rear taillight on the driver's side was damaged. The driver's side window or windshield may have been broken. That damage is significant in ways that go beyond simple identification. Damage to a vehicle tells a story. Sometimes it tells a story of ordinary road misfortune, a parking lot collision, a curb struck at an awkward angle, a fender bender that the owner could not afford to repair. Sometimes it tells a different kind of story. And in the context of a vehicle associated with a woman who vanished under unclear circumstances after last being seen with a person who is considered armed and dangerous, the specific pattern of damage to the driver's side of that gold Ford Explorer is not something to be read as neutral or incidental. The driver's side door. The driver's side window or windshield. The driver's side rear taillight. All on the same side. All concentrated around the area where a driver would be seated. This may mean nothing. Vehicles accumulate damage in all kinds of ways and for all kinds of reasons, and the pattern described could absolutely reflect a series of unrelated incidents with no sinister explanation. But it could also mean something. In the context of everything else that is known about this case, it is the kind of detail that investigators and researchers look at closely, that they hold in their minds as they reconstruct the possible sequence of events, that they do not dismiss without consideration. The vehicle has not been found. The official record does not include a recovery of the gold Ford Explorer. As of the most recent updates to the databases that track Cresenda Stevens' case, she remains listed as missing. Her vehicle remains unlocated. The case remains open. Which is why the search in the St. Johns River matters. Which is why the work that Jeremy Sides and Adam Brown are doing, dragging sonar through the dark water of Jacksonville's tidal river system, is not an exercise in curiosity or content creation. It is, potentially, the closest thing to an active investigation that this case currently has. If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment right now with the words "I am still here." Let us see who is truly following this story and who is committed to finding the truth about what happened to Cresenda Stevens. Your comment matters. Your presence in this video matters. Because every view, every comment, every moment of engagement tells the algorithm that this case deserves attention. Stay with us. We are going deeper. Let us talk about what happens when a vehicle enters the St. Johns River. Not in the abstract, not as a general principle, but specifically, what happens in this river, to this kind of vehicle, in these conditions. Because understanding the taphonomy of a submerged vehicle in a tidal river is essential to understanding both why finding the Explorer is difficult and why it is still possible. When a vehicle enters the water, it sinks. This is not instantaneous. Vehicles have air pockets, in the passenger compartment and in sealed cavities throughout the chassis and body panels, and these air pockets create buoyancy that can keep a vehicle afloat briefly before the water finds its way in through every gap and opening and overwhelms the air. The rate at which a vehicle fills with water depends on how it entered the water, whether the windows were open, whether the impact cracked the body panels, whether the water entered through the air intake or other mechanical openings. A vehicle that enters the water wheels first, relatively slowly, might float for several minutes before sinking. A vehicle that goes in nose first at speed might be underwater in under a minute. Once it reaches the bottom, the vehicle begins the long process of integration into the riverbed environment. In the St. Johns, with its tidal dynamics, the first thing that happens is the accumulation of fine sediment. The river carries suspended particles, silt, clay, organic matter, in the water column, and when the current slows, these particles settle out of the water and onto whatever solid surface is available. A vehicle on the bottom of the St. Johns is an enormous solid surface, and it accumulates sediment continuously. The rate of accumulation depends on the location, faster in areas of lower current, slower in the channels where the tidal flow is stronger, but over years, a vehicle in a relatively sheltered location can be buried in silt up to its roofline and beyond. Simultaneously, biological colonization begins. In brackish tidal water, the organisms that attach to hard surfaces include barnacles, mussels, tube worms, algae, and various species of invertebrates that find a vehicle on the riverbed to be exactly the kind of hard substrate they require. Within months, a submerged vehicle in the St. John's begins to accumulate a crust of biological material that changes its appearance and its sonar signature. Within years, the biological crust can be several centimeters thick, obscuring the original surface of the vehicle and transforming it from a recognizable manufactured object into something that looks more like a heavily encrusted rock formation. This is why the diver team, when they make note of a sonar target near the bridge that looks like it might have its roof compressed or absent, are not necessarily looking at a vehicle that was damaged before it entered the water. They may be looking at a vehicle that has accumulated so much biological material on its upper surfaces over the course of years that the original roofline has been effectively buried and replaced by a mound of barnacles and silt. The original shape, the shape that went into the water on whatever day the vehicle entered the river, may not be what is visible to sonar now. A gold Ford Explorer that entered the St. John's River on June 1, 2017 would, by the time of this search, have been underwater for approximately 7 years. 7 years of silt accumulation. 7 years of barnacle growth. 7 years of tidal current moving across it twice a day, every day, redistributing the sediment around it, working it incrementally into the fabric of the riverbed. 7 years of the river doing what the river does, slowly, patiently, without any consideration for what it might be hiding or from whom. Identifying a vehicle in that condition, from a sonar image, from a dive in near-zero visibility water, this is not easy work. But it is possible. The geometry of a vehicle is distinct enough, even under years of biological accretion, to produce a sonar signature that a trained and experienced operator can recognize. The width of a Ford Explorer. The length. The height. The relationship between the wheelbase and the overall footprint. These measurements are fixed, and while the outer surface of the vehicle may be obscured by barnacles and silt, the underlying dimensions remain, and they show up in the sonar return in ways that can be matched against the known specifications of the vehicle type. This is the methodology. This is what the team is doing when they make another pass over a suspicious sonar target. They are measuring. They are comparing. They are asking the river for information about what it is holding, and the river is answering in the language of acoustic reflection. The search that day covered more ground than could be fully described in the footage that was captured. The boat moved across the designated search area in the systematic, overlapping pattern that sonar searches require, each pass slightly offset from the last, building up a composite picture of the bottom that no single pass could provide. The team communicated about what they were seeing. They flagged targets. They returned to targets that warranted closer examination. They dove where the sonar suggested something was there. The tidal dynamics complicated everything, as they always do in this river. The water level was changing. The areas that had been searchable at the beginning of the day were becoming shallower as the tide shifted, or deeper, depending on which direction the tidal cycle was moving. What looked like promising search territory from the surface could, at low tide, reveal itself as nothing but mud, impassable, undivable, shallow enough that a vehicle, if there was one there, would have been visible without any specialized equipment at all. This is the nature of the river. It shows you what it wants to show you when it wants to show it. At high tide, it looks deep and secretive and full of possibility. At low tide, it reveals its shallows and its mudflats and the organic debris that accumulates in the areas where the current slows, and it makes a searcher feel, for a moment, that perhaps they have been looking for something in a place that could not possibly hold it. But the deep pockets. Those are the key. The deep pockets are always there, regardless of tidal stage, tucked into the bottom topography of the river in locations that are not obvious from the surface and not visible at any tidal level. A vehicle in a deep pocket could be in 15 or 20 feet of water at low tide. It could be in 25 feet at high tide. It would be invisible from the surface, invisible from a boat without sonar, invisible to aerial searches, invisible to anyone who had not specifically set out to look for it with the right equipment. The deep pockets were what the team was looking for. The deep pockets were, in all likelihood, where the answers were. Whether the answer to Cresenda Stevens' disappearance was one of those answers, whether her gold Ford Explorer was sitting in a deep pocket in the upper eastern section of the St. Johns River, waiting to be found, was the question that drove the search forward hour by hour as the tidal river breathed in and out around the boat. Let us now look more carefully at the broader landscape of cold cases in Jacksonville, because Cresenda Stevens' disappearance did not occur in isolation. It occurred in a city with a significant and well-documented history of missing persons cases, many of them involving vulnerable individuals, many of them connected in one way or another to the city's extensive waterway system. Understanding that context does not diminish Chriscinda's individual story. It amplifies it. It places her disappearance within a pattern that demands explanation and demands response. Jacksonville is the largest city by area in the contiguous United States. It covers over 874 square miles, a consequence of the 1968 consolidation that merged the city of Jacksonville with Duval County and created an administrative entity of extraordinary geographic scope. Within that area, the water is everywhere. The St. Johns River and its tributaries run through the city. Tidal creeks wind through neighborhoods and commercial areas and industrial zones. The Intercoastal Waterway connects Jacksonville to the broader network of sheltered Atlantic coastal water that runs the length of the eastern seaboard. There is water that is accessible and water that is not. There is water that is watched and water that is not. There is water that, in the middle of the night, in the absence of surveillance and witnesses, would receive whatever was put into it with perfect silence and hold it perfectly still. The Jacksonville Sheriff's Office maintains an active missing persons database that reflects the scale of the problem in this city. Across the years, cases have accumulated, men and women and children, some found, some resolved, many remaining open. Vulnerable populations are disproportionately represented in those numbers, as they are in missing persons cases across the country, people experiencing homelessness, people struggling with addiction, people in abusive relationships, people whose lives have brought them into contact with individuals who pose a danger to them. Cresenda Stevens fits elements of this profile. She was a woman living, by all indications, in circumstances that included some level of instability, a history of leaving the area, a vehicle that was damaged and carried out of state plates, a last known contact with a man who carries the specific designations that Danny Vidal carries in the official record of this case. She was not invisible before she disappeared. She had family. She had friends. She had the family friend who last saw her on June 1st. She had people who noticed when she stopped communicating and who cared enough to report her missing and to keep her case alive through the years during which no resolution came. But she was also, in the brutal arithmetic of investigative resource allocation, a person whose case did not generate the kind of sustained public attention that sometimes drives cold case investigations forward. She did not have a trial. She did not have an arrest. She did not have a family with the platform or resources to keep her story in the public eye through the years. She had a listing in the Charlie Project database. She had a case number with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. She had the people who loved her, keeping her memory alive in whatever private ways people keep the memory of the lost alive when the official machinery of investigation has moved on. And she had, eventually, 2 civilian divers with a boat and a sonar unit and a stubborn refusal to let the river keep its secrets forever. The civilian investigation community that Jeremy Sides and Adam Brown belong to is a relatively new phenomenon in the history of cold case work, enabled by a combination of factors that did not exist even a generation ago. Affordable, consumer-grade sonar equipment that can produce usable bottom imaging. The Internet, which allows cold case researchers to compile and share information about missing persons cases with a speed and thoroughness that was impossible in the era of paper files and local news archives. YouTube and social media platforms that allow investigators to share their work with large audiences and to crowdsource both financial support and investigative leads. And a cultural moment in which true crime content has moved from a niche interest to one of the most consumed categories of media in the English-speaking world. That cultural moment is worth examining for a moment, because it is both the engine that funds and amplifies work like Jeremy and Adams and a phenomenon that carries its own complications and responsibilities. The true crime genre, at its best, shines light on cases that have gone cold, brings public attention to missing persons who would otherwise be forgotten, and creates the kind of pressure and scrutiny that sometimes dislodges information that has been sitting in someone's memory for years, waiting for the moment when a question was asked in public loudly enough that the person holding the information felt compelled to answer. At its worst, the genre can treat real human tragedies as entertainment, reduce complex cases to simplified narratives that serve dramatic purposes at the expense of accuracy, and subject the families of missing persons and murder victims to scrutiny and exposure that they did not ask for and may not want. The best practitioners of the form, the documentarians and investigators and YouTube channels that have built genuine reputations for rigor and responsibility in this space, understand this tension and navigate it deliberately, keeping the humanity of the missing at the center of the work even when the work itself is, unavoidably, also content. Cold Case Crimelab exists in this space. The cases covered on this channel are real cases. The missing persons whose stories are told here are real people, or were real people, whose fates in many cases remain unknown. The work of building and maintaining public attention on these cases, of keeping names in circulation long after the initial wave of media attention has passed, is genuinely valuable work. It is the kind of work that occasionally produces results, that results in the tip called in, the witness who finally comes forward, the piece of information that moves a cold case forward after years of stagnation. Cresenda Stevens's case needs this. It has needed it for nearly a decade. And it needs it now, specifically, because the search that is being conducted in the St. Johns River, the search that brought Jeremy Sides and Adam Brown and their team to Jacksonville, represents a concrete opportunity for progress in a case that has been static for years. We need to spend some time on what the river search might actually reveal, and what it might not reveal, because both possibilities are important and neither should be misrepresented. If the gold Ford Explorer that Cresenda Stevens was driving when she disappeared is in the St. Johns River, if it is in one of the deep pockets in the upper eastern section that the search team was targeting, finding it would be significant for several reasons. First, it would confirm the general location of the vehicle's final destination, which would provide investigators with a geographic anchor for the subsequent investigation. Vehicle entry points into bodies of water can sometimes be identified based on the position of the vehicle in the water, the condition of any barriers or embankments near the entry point, and physical evidence around the entry location. If the Explorer is in the river, the next step would be to identify where it went in, and that location might provide additional evidence about the circumstances of its entry. Second, a vehicle recovered from the bottom of a river after years of submersion can still yield forensic evidence, though the nature and quality of that evidence depends on many factors, the depth and temperature of the water, the degree of silt encapsulation, whether the vehicle was sealed before entry. Biological material, hair, fiber, fingerprints, blood, degrades in submerged environments, but the rate of degradation varies and is not always complete. Cases have been solved using evidence recovered from vehicles that have been underwater for years. It is not guaranteed, but it is possible. Third, and perhaps most significantly from the perspective of Chriscinda's family, if the vehicle is found, the question of whether she is in it is answered. This is the hardest part of this kind of search to write about, because it requires acknowledging directly and honestly that the search for a missing person's vehicle in a river is, in many cases, also a search for the missing person. Human remains in a submerged vehicle, after years of exposure to the river environment, may be significantly altered from their original state. But they may not be entirely absent. Recovery is possible. Identification is possible. And for a family that has been living with the uncertainty of an open missing persons case for 9 years, the resolution of that uncertainty, even in the most devastating possible form, can be a kind of relief that coexists with grief. If the vehicle is not found in the river, if the search comes up empty in the specific target area, this also tells us something, though it is harder to interpret. The absence of the vehicle in the river does not mean the vehicle was never in the river. Sonar searches, even thorough and professional ones, have limitations. The deep pockets of the St. John's are numerous and not all of them are fully accessible to a single search team in a single day. The vehicle could be in a section that was not covered. It could be buried too deeply in silt to produce a clear sonar signature. It could be in the river and not yet found. Or it could not be in the river at all. The vehicle could be in any number of other locations, another waterway, an impound lot under a different name, abandoned in a rural area, stripped and broken down. The gold Ford Explorer is missing because Cresenda Stevens is missing, and Cresenda Stevens is missing because of whatever happened on June 1, 2017, and whatever happened on that day has left the vehicle somewhere that has not been found in 9 years of searching. The river is the most compelling lead. But it is not the only possibility. In the late afternoon, when the tidal shift had altered the character of the search area and the team had covered the primary targets on their list, the nature of what they had found, or not found, began to crystallize. The Nissans. 3 Nissan vehicles had been identified as missing in connection with persons cases in the broader Jacksonville area, and the search team had flagged the possibility that one or more of them might be in this section of the river. 3 families waiting for answers. 3 case numbers in 3 different files at the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. 3 names attached to 3 lives that had been cut off in unclear circumstances and whose vehicles had entered some waterway or location unknown at some point after the person's disappearance. The sonar targets that had been identified through the day's searching included shapes that could potentially match Nissan vehicles. Identifying a specific vehicle make and model from a sonar image of a heavily silted, barnacle-covered object at the bottom of a tidal river is not a precise science. It requires experience and judgment and the willingness to go down and look directly when the sonar is not conclusive. It requires multiple passes, multiple angles, the comparison of dimensions against known specifications, the consideration of context, where is this vehicle relative to known access points to the water, what trajectory would a vehicle have to follow to end up in this position on the bottom. This work was being done systematically, carefully, with the specific focus of investigators who understood the stakes of what they might find. And then there was the question of the Ford Explorer. The gold, or tan, Ford Explorer with the Georgia plates and the damaged driver's side and the potentially broken window. The vehicle associated with Chriscinda Stevens. The object that, if it was in this river, would represent 9 years of a woman's disappearance arriving at a moment of potential resolution. The search continued as the river moved around the team, tidal and indifferent and old. There is a particular quality to the grief of a family with a missing loved one that is unlike almost any other kind of grief. Most grief, as devastating as it is, has a defined object. There is a loss, and the loss is known. The person is dead, and this is confirmed, and the grieving process, as long and as painful as it is, moves from the sharp early stages through the longer middle period and eventually to a place of integration, where the loss becomes part of the landscape of a life rather than the totality of it. This is not to minimize the devastation of ordinary grief. It is to identify a quality that it has, a definiteness, a reality that is established even as it is being mourned, that the grief of the families of missing persons does not have. The family of Chriscinda Stevens does not know what happened to her. They know she has been gone since June 1, 2017. They know she was last seen in the company of Danny Vidal. They know she was classified as endangered missing by the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. They know that the search teams have been in the water looking for her vehicle. They know that 9 years have passed without her contacting them, without the consistent communication that was her established pattern, without a word or a message or any sign of life from the woman who always kept in touch. What they do not know is everything else. They do not know exactly what happened on June 1. They do not know the sequence of events that led from the last moment of Chriscinda alive and present in the world to the silence that followed. They do not know whether she is in the river. They do not know whether she is somewhere else. They do not know how it ended, or if it has ended, or whether there is some scenario, however unlikely it might seem at this point, in which she is still alive somewhere, unable or unwilling to communicate. The mind of a family member living with this kind of uncertainty does not stay in one place. It cannot. The uncertainty is its own kind of torment, a loop that runs through every possibility from the most hopeful to the most devastating and back again, never settling, never resolving, because there is no resolution available. There is only the waiting. The hoping. The fearing. The holding of both the hope and the fear simultaneously, because to abandon either one is to make a choice about the outcome of a story that has not yet revealed its ending. This is what the gift of closure means. Not happiness. Not relief in the simple sense. But the end of the loop. The replacement of not knowing with knowing, whatever that knowledge turns out to be. The ability to say, with certainty, this is what happened. And from that certainty, however painful, the possibility of a different kind of grief, the defined, mournable kind, begins. The team in the boat understood this. It was in the way they worked, the care they brought to each sonar pass, the attention they paid to each target, the willingness to stay on the water as long as the day allowed. They were not looking for content. They were looking for closure on behalf of families who had been waiting for it for years. As the day's search wound toward its conclusion, the team compiled what they had found. Sonar targets. Locations of interest. Shapes on the riverbed that warranted return visits, that had the geometry and the dimensions to potentially be the vehicles associated with the missing persons cases they were working. The near-the-bridge target with the possibly compressed roofline. The target with the toolbox-shaped object in the rear. The shapes that might be Nissans, that might be one or more of the 3 missing Nissan vehicles that the team had flagged before entering the water. None of these had been definitively identified on this particular day. That is important to state clearly, because the nature of this work does not permit simple, clean revelations at the end of a search day. Identification requires time. It requires divers going down to specific targets and confirming what they found. It requires cross-referencing with vehicle records, with license plate databases, with the specific identifying characteristics, model year, body style, damage profile, that allow a specific vehicle recovered from a specific location to be matched to a specific missing persons case. This process is ongoing. It extends beyond the single day of searching depicted in the footage. It extends beyond the visible action of the boat moving across the water and the sonar screen filling with shapes. It is the work that happens after the cameras are off, in the exchange of information with investigators, in the official recoveries that follow civilian discoveries, in the quiet, unglamorous paperwork that converts a sonar target into a confirmed finding into an official case development. The St. Johns River was not giving up everything it knew on this particular day. But it was giving up something. The shapes were there. The targets were real. The deep pockets had been located and mapped and would be returned to. And somewhere in the tidal water of the upper eastern section of the St. Johns River, in Jacksonville, Florida, the answer to what happened to Cresenda Joy Stevens may be waiting in the dark. Before we close, let us return one more time to Chriscinda herself. Not to the case. Not to the river. Not to the search or the sonar or the civilian investigators or the official record. To her. She was born in January, 1978. She was 39 years old when she disappeared. She had blue eyes and blonde hair and she was 5 feet and 2 inches tall and she weighed 108 pounds and she had tattoos she had chosen, marks she had put on her body because they meant something to her. Little Red Riding Hood and the Big Bad Wolf. The girl in the red cape and the creature that meant her harm, inked into her skin on her right bicep, carried with her wherever she went. There is something in that image, the choice of that particular fairy tale, the one about a young woman traveling through a dangerous world and encountering the thing that should not be trusted, the thing that wears a familiar face and uses the language of safety to get close enough to do damage, that resonates uncomfortably with the circumstances of her disappearance. This is not to overread a tattoo. People choose tattoo imagery for all kinds of reasons, and the meaning of a piece of body art is personal and complex and not reducible to a simple symbolic reading. But it is to say that she was a woman who knew that the world contained danger. Who had thought about danger and had chosen to carry a reminder of it on her body. Who had lived long enough and experienced enough to understand, on some level, that not everyone who presents themselves as safe is safe. She always kept in touch. Right up until the moment she didn't. She has been missing for 9 years. Her family is still out there. The Jacksonville Sheriff's Office case is still open. The tip line, 904-630-2627, still accepts information. And somewhere in Jacksonville, or somewhere in the databases of people who move through the world without considering the consequences of their movements, there is someone who knows something about what happened on June 1, 2017. The river may tell us part of the story. But someone who is alive and breathing and carrying this information needs to tell us the rest. If you know anything about the disappearance of Cresenda Stevens, if you saw the Gold Ford Explorer, if you know Danny Vidal, if you were in Jacksonville on June 1, 2017, and you saw something that did not make sense to you at the time, please call the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. The number is 904-630-2627. You can call anonymously. You can call First Coast Crime Stoppers. You can send information through any channel that feels safe to you. But please, if you know something, say something. Because Chriscinda's family has been waiting for 9 years and they deserve more than silence. If you made it all the way through this case, every minute, every detail, every piece of the story we have been able to piece together, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel was built for. You are someone who believes that cold cases deserve sustained attention. You are someone who understands that missing people are not statistics. You are someone who refuses to let a woman like Cresenda Stevens become nothing more than a database entry and a faded news clip from 2017. Subscribe to Cold Case Crimelab right now so you are here for every case we bring you. Like this video and share it, because somewhere out there is the person who has the piece of this puzzle that we have not been able to find, and the only way to reach that person is to put this story in front of as many eyes as possible. Leave a comment with Chriscinda's name. Say it out loud. Keep it in circulation. Keep her real. We will not stop until we have answers. We will be back. This is Cold Case Crimelab.